Hey folks, welcome to Narratives. Narratives is a podcast exploring the ways in which the world is better than in the past, the ways it is worse, and the paths towards a better, more definite vision of the future. I'm your host, Will Jarvis, and I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this episode. I hope you enjoy it. You can find show notes, transcripts, and videos at narrativespodcast.com. Well, Trevor, how are you doing this afternoon?
I am doing great, thanks. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks again for coming back on the show. I think you're our first repeat guest, which is super cool. I'm excited about the effort you're working on and the problems you're admiring, and you've got a new initiative there. I kind of wanted to highlight on the show and get a little more eyes on it, if that makes sense, because I really believe in kind of the mission you're working on. Just for someone who perhaps didn't listen to the last episode, do you mind giving us like a brief bio and some of the big problems you're interested in?
Yeah. Okay, cool. So, hi, Trevor. In terms of a bio, I have a really weird, non-traditional background. So done like a bootstrapped ed tech / tutoring business, and then veered into doing a biotech startup after spending several years posting essays on Reddit and arguing about them in the comment, like biotech essays and biology essays. So what we're working on essentially is, with this biotech startup, Highway Pharmaceuticals, is immunosuppressants. And specifically what we're working on right now is creating safer, better versions of immunosuppressants for animal autoimmune diseases, human autoimmune diseases, and eventually human neurodegenerative diseases like, dementia and Parkinson's and that kind of thing.
I love that. How did you first come up with the drug cyclosporin as the one to use, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So, when I got interested in this problem, I was looking for, sort of ways to tackle it. And I came across this drug, cyclosporin, which is, used to be a really widely used immunosuppressant in humans, sort of fallen out of fashion, still pretty widely used in animals. And what I thought was interesting about it is it's, this really powerful drug. It has great effects in a ton of different diseases, everything from, psoriasis to IBD to, there are even some early studies done on like ALS and stuff where it showed some promise. But it had always been, sort of relegated or used less because it has a bunch of bad side effects and it's pretty hard to dose. It's a very tricky drug. So, I was focusing a lot on how can we make this drug, which is so powerful but so hard to use, how can we make it easier to use, safer, better? And so, doing research on that eventually came up with this idea that if we combined it with a, certain other drug, which is a metabolic inhibitor, we could solve a lot of the issues while keeping the potency. So that's, it started off by looking at some human case studies where they had done this accidentally and then move on to in vitro studies. And, now like we're really testing this in, cats.
And why cats? You always hear about mice. You hear about perhaps these rhesus monkeys, perhaps dogs, beagles, or something. But you don't often hear cats.
Okay. Yes. So there's a good reason why you don't often hear cats. It's actually funny. I have a friend who was like thinking of testing drugs, and he was like, "Do you think I should test my drug in cats?" And I was like, "Probably not, unless you're really certain that you want to." And so, cats in general are harder to deal with than dogs, which would be the other obvious option. Cats, they're tricky animals, as anyone who's owned a cat. They're a little smaller than dogs. And, they also, can have some bad reactions to certain drugs like Tylenol, for instance. Cats can't take Tylenol for sort of biological reason. But, what we found when we were looking at like really good uses for this safer version of cyclosporin is essentially that cats get this, you know, autoimmune disease called feline stomatitis. It affects about 1% of all cats. And like right now, it really doesn't have a good treatment. And we wanted to, think like, okay, could this be something that our immunosuppressant could be used for? So we were talking to vets, and, of all the diseases that we talked to vets about, they were like, oh my God, yes. Like any treatment you can create for feline stomatitis would be great. Because right now the only option is surgery. So that's really where we started our exploration of like using cats as our first indication here.
I love that. I love that. Can you talk a little bit about the it's feline stomatitis, correctly?
You are correct.
Awesome. Can you talk a little bit about how it affects cats and perhaps why and how a safer cyclosporin could really be useful in this context?
Yeah, sure. So feline stomatitis, it's sort of like have you ever had like a canker sore?
Yeah.
Yeah. So stomatitis is close to that, except cats get it really bad. So they get basically a bunch of sores all over their mouth and lips. And like, they can't eat, they can't drink, and they're really miserable. And if something's not done, it can be as bad as you'd expect not eating and drinking to be. So that's basically, the disease, and it affects, about 1 million cats per year in the US. And like the current treatment is pulling teeth. So they literally will sedate the cat, pull all its teeth. And this will happen to cats. They're like 2-3 years old. It's really sad.
Oh man.
It's expensive, can be $1,000, $2,000. I've even heard $3,000. And it only works like 70% of the time. So it's rough altogether. So we were, looking at these studies and found that a couple people had experimented with using cyclosporin instead of pulling teeth. So they were, used it before pulling teeth, like instead of it, and they also used it after. And basically what we found, or what these authors found, is that cyclosporin does work, but again, it's difficult to use. It has a high rate of side effects. And so, they, like, the authors basically in the papers themselves were like, this looks really good, but it's tricky enough that, you should probably stick with like surgery first and then cyclosporin only if you absolutely have to. So then reading this, these are papers from like 2006, 2010, 2013. I was reading that and I was like, I have a better version of cyclosporin. So that's sort of how it got started on the idea of feline stomatitis.
That's great. How expensive are feline, clinical trials, and how's the regulatory environment difficult with different between humans and cats, if that makes sense?
Yes, that's a great question. So there's a big difference there. So basically, human clinical trials, you've got you get your sort of preclinical work, and then you talk to the FDA and you say, I would like to test my drug in humans. And the FDA says, okay, make sure you have all your ducks in a row, make sure the drug is safe, safe, and you can manufacture it and whatever. So that can be super expensive. And then they allow you to test your drug in healthy humans. Then they allow you to test your drug for safety in healthy humans. And at last, they allow you to test your drug in sick humans. And there's a lot of, paperwork around this because, you don't want to be hurting anyone. For animals, it's really different. So for animals, the FDA's basic position is, we don't care what you do to lab animals. Like, you have to abide by minimal ethical standards. And for the record, we abide by way more than that. We're working with people who are, very careful about, the well-being of their animals. But from the FDA's standard, they actually don't need to talk to you until you want to work on basically pets. So, we don't have to talk to the FDA when we work on our lab cats, which we're going to be doing for our healthy lab cats and for our safety trial. And then we're going to talk to the FDA once we want to, recruit some people whose pets actually have feline stomatitis. And so the cost of this like initial trial where we're testing our drug combination on healthy cats and saying, okay, it's reasonably safe. It works better than the original version of cyclosporin. It can be dosed less often and, can stay around in the blood longer. So that cost is about 300,000 all in. So that's actually, we're currently fundraising right now to basically cover that gap, which is, we have about 200,000 in the bank, and we need to cover the extra 100,000 to finish out our, pilot trial.
That's great. That's great. And can you give like context for listeners who might not know how much human trials cost? What is the cost delta between, your study and doing an equivalent trial in humans?
Yeah. So we started off doing it, thinking about this in humans. We had a human autoimmune disease that we wanted to, test this combination on. And so the cost for that would have been around 1.4 million for basically doing, probably would have ended up being more than that, probably around 1.6 million for doing like a good high quality, trial in healthy humans. And, meanwhile, we're going to be about 300,000 for a good high quality trial in healthy cats. So, it's a big difference. Cats, there's less regulation. You can pay cats in cat food, rather than money. Cats are very happy to stay overnight in the facility because, they don't have a home that they're waiting to get back to. So yeah, it's much cheaper.
That's great. That's great. Why don't more people use, cats as subjects for these trials?
So, if you think of cats specifically, the basic reason why you would use dogs instead of cats is because cats are tricky. Like, the cats that we're working with have actually been trained to take drugs and trained to be okay with having their blood drawn. And if they're not, then, giving drugs to a cat is,
difficult.
Yeah, they will bite you. Meanwhile, dogs, you put it in peanut butter and they're happy to take it. So that's why people don't use cats instead of dogs. The reason why people don't often do what we do and do, sort of the animal trial instead of the human trial or switch from human to animal is really economics. So for, your average disease, it's going to be way more lucrative in humans than it is in animals. So for instance, a really big example is not a lot of people know there's actually a drug for doggy dementia, for basically canine Alzheimer's. It probably doesn't work, but more to the point, it's not that widely prescribed because the only real concern people have with doggy dementia is like, you want to make sure your dog doesn't, pee inside the house. But other than that, like people don't really care. Meanwhile, of course, human Alzheimer's is something people care a lot about. And it's like, a drug for human Alzheimer's would bring in like 100 billion a year. So, there's not that many diseases that people care enough about in animals to be willing to pay for them. And, feline stomatitis is one of them. There are a couple other autoimmune diseases like atopic dermatitis, like the itchy skin rash that people pay for, and that's like $1 billion a year. But there's really not that many drugs that are worth developing in animals from an economic perspective.
That's great. That's great. What do you see? What do you expect to see from this trial specifically? What kind of outcome do you expect to see?
Yeah. So, what we're going to see at the end of this trial is basically that our drug is reasonably safe, that it works better than the original form of cyclosporin, and that, we can dose it basically once per week, or roughly once or twice per week instead of the current cyclosporin, which is once per day. And so that's pretty exciting because, cyclosporin right now is a pretty commonly used drug in animals. It's used in dogs, it's used in cats. It used to be used really commonly for atopic dermatitis, which, as I mentioned, is $1 billion a year disease in dogs. So, essentially at the end of this trial, if we can say, we are, I don't know, 80% sure, 90% sure that our drug is better than the original form of cyclosporin, that means at the end of this trial, we're going to be pretty sure that we can, at the very least, take on the, X hundreds of millions per dollars that, per year that people spend on animal cyclosporin. And that's not even counting expanding the market like we plan to do with feline stomatitis.
That's great. That's great. I'm curious, what are the steps after the trial? Like, what do you need to do next to commercialize, let's say, just in pets?
Yeah. So, if we want to go it totally on our own, we have to do safety trial, which is basically recruit a bunch of cats and follow them for a long time as they're given this to make sure that no safety issues crop up in, like, say, month 4, because the trial we're doing right now is only 2 weeks. So we would only see, very immediate safety effects. And then after that, we would talk to the FDA, say, here's what we have so far. Here's what we want to do next. They give us the okay. And then we basically go to a bunch of vets all around the country and say, do you have owners with feline stomatitis? Cats with feline stomatitis. If so, can we, recruit them for our trial, and, they'll take this experimental drug and see if it works better than surgery. So that would be, basically it. And then we would, of course, market and sell the drug. So that's if we go totally on our own. Another option is, we've already been approached by a couple different big pharmaceutical companies who are interested in licensing the drug. And what's neat about that is they would license it only in animals. So, they basically give us upfront payments and then milestone payments and then some sort of royalty fee. And they would do basically everything that I had talked about, the safety trial, the FDA, the pivotal trial and with pets. So they would do all that. And then we could focus just going back to the human autoimmune and human neurodegenerative stuff. So I think, once we finish this pilot trial, we're going to, get in some serious talks with a couple of these big pharmaceutical companies that have approached us, see what their thoughts are. And then, we'll basically have our option. We can either go it on our own or, license it out and go specifically for human autoimmune disease. So it's, some good times, some good choices to make.
That's great. Do you have any sense on which way you want to go? Do you want to keep it in-house? Do you want to, license things out?
So if I could get, so I would love to license it out specifically for animals, because I think that's a less, I am sort of human biased. I think it's a less important problem than, the autoimmune diseases that exist for humans that, are really, can be pretty devastating and, don't have great treatments. So, if I can find a partner who's, an animal health company that's, I think is responsible, that will, do the trials correctly, that will, actually bring the drug to market and not just shelve it, then I would love to partner with one of them. But, something that I've literally already told, like, the pharmaceutical companies we've been talking to is, part of my conditions for licensing would be, you have to take this as far as possible. Like, I really would not be interested in anyone, paying us money to basically put this on a shelf forever, which is something that, depending on their incentives, they might do. Because, for instance, Elanco is still selling, the original form of cyclosporin, and their incentives, if they license it, might just be, let's take out this competitor.
That makes sense. Speaking of humans, can you talk a little bit about the application of your drug in humans, specifically for human autoimmune diseases?
Yeah. So most human autoimmune diseases used to be treated with cyclosporin. So, back in like the 80s, if you had psoriasis, if you had Crohn's, basically anything, you would have been given cyclosporin. And that's become less and less common as biologics have become more common, because cyclosporin, as I mentioned, is a tough drug to administer, and biologics are generally safer. So the thing that still exists in human autoimmune diseases is basically a combination of two things. Some people just can't afford biologics. I mean, you're paying a minimum of $1,000 a month. So, anyone who who has Crohn's or ulcerative colitis is paying a minimum of $1,000 a month and probably more. And then there's also drugs that, diseases that don't have really clear physiology. We don't really understand, how the disease starts, how it progresses. And so we can't develop biologics for those. And so that's a big place where, cyclosporin could be really useful. So right now, actually, the absolute biggest use case for cyclosporin is still in organ transplants, because, you can't have a biologic because it's every part of your immune system attacks an organ transplant. So it has to be a general immunosuppression. But there's also other stuff that's, could be really useful, like, lupus nephritis, which is a side effect of lupus where, people can get some serious kidney disease. There was actually literally just an improved version of cyclosporin developed for that. And that's approved and that's being sold right now. And we think that our drug would be better than that. It's called voclosporin. So that would be, for instance, one really appealing target for us is, creating better treatments for something like lupus nephritis.
Makes sense. What about neurodegeneration? What applications do you see there?
Yeah. So as you notice, some people, doctors mostly are surprised when I say, we're doing neurodegeneration after autoimmune disease because, they think of cyclosporin as this immunosuppressant. But, I wrote a whole blog post about this actually. Cyclosporin is this really interesting drug that has sort of this completely different side effect that it protects the mitochondria from apoptosis. So like, mitochondria, as you may or may not know, started off as a completely different, bacteria, or I think it was actually technically a prokaryote, but started off as a different cell that billions of years ago, our cells sort of subsumed and adopted as, the powerhouse of the cell. And one interesting thing about that is the mitochondria has retained some of its, characteristics back when it used to be a, organism on its own. And one of those is in times of a lot of stress, it kills itself, which maybe didn't originally kill itself. Maybe there was a different sort of evolutionary adaptation. But, for us now, the practical results of that is in times of high stress, mitochondria will die in large numbers. And that can be really bad if it happens in your brain or nervous system. So for instance, one thing that cyclosporin has actually been studied in is like traumatic brain injury. If you, a really common thing is people get hit in the head really hard and they seem, okay-ish for like 24 hours, 48 hours. And then all of a sudden they go downhill really rapidly. And what happens basically is, that causes stress to the neurons, and the mitochondria start dying. And as they die, they create more stress on the other mitochondria. And you get this cascade where, from the doctor's perspective, it looks like the person with traumatic brain injury was fine for like 24 hours after the injury. And then all of a sudden, they're experience like really significant brain trauma. And so cyclosporin, as calcineurin inhibitor, is something that can prevent that. So there have been a bunch of experiments around that. There have been experiments around using cyclosporin and also a similar drug called tacrolimus in dementia, with the same idea that some forms of dementia can be caused by that sort of like cascading mitochondria death, all the powerhouses of the cell in the brain, sort of going out at the same time. So those are the sorts of neurodegenerative diseases that's going to be a lot trickier to run a trial in than autoimmune disease because it's less well understood. But I think that could be, something that'd be really, really helpful, and when I think of like maximum impact sort of stuff, something like, almost none of the neurodegenerative diseases have good treatments. And so, there's so many of them that are mitochondria related and that we could, do some really interesting trials to try to fix.
And that feels like the ultimate goal to me. It's like a real treatment for dementia.
Yeah.
And a bonus, perhaps you save American football as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So football, there's also strokes. That's another one that again, there's a lot of different stuff. It's really interesting. And there's been all this hints about in the literature for years, but there's been no economic incentive to run these trials because cyclosporin itself is generic. So no one can make money off it if, no one can make money off it, in sort of this monopolistic way if they successfully, fund a trial. So it's just random academics cobbling together grants here and there to run these trials. But, if we could do that could be huge.
So that's your sense why it really has not happened. There has not really been an economic incentive to go out there and make this a reality.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So, that's a lot of people don't know this, but in human trials, as I mentioned, they're super expensive. To run a trial in healthy people is, at least $1.5 million. To run a trial in sick people can be way more expensive, depending on what you're doing, easily 20, 30 million. Academics don't have access to that kind of money. It's the only groups that have access to that sort of money are really, a couple very well-funded nonprofits and then the, for-profit companies, the pharmaceutical companies. So, if there's no economic incentive for, running this trial, if no one can patent the results at the end of it, it's almost certainly not going to happen unless, you get that random one really funded nonprofit that's happy to do it. So, and that's there's a list of 3 or 4 nonprofits that fund trials like that. And, it's not the ones you'd expect either. People sometimes are like, oh, why don't you just contact there's the Allergic Disease Society or whatever, or why don't you contact the Lupus Foundation? And they don't give out money like that, and they don't have money like that. They can give out a grant of $50,000 to run a trial in petri dishes for a scientist, but they don't remotely have the funding to do even $1 million trial. Never mind a $30 million trial.
Right. It's just they're capital constrained, and it's too difficult for them. They're not really set up for that. Trevor, I really love the effort. I'm really inspired by your work, and it's been nice to see your progression over time. I think we talked about a year ago, and you've made a lot of progress, which I find really inspiring. Trevor, if people want to help, how can they do that? What are your big needs right now?
So big needs right now are, the biggest thing is capital, and then second biggest thing is, if you're connected to, any of the sort of pharmaceutical companies who would be interested in specifically animal health. But more importantly, probably for the listeners of this show, if you find this interesting, if you'd like to help, we're running a crowd investing campaign right now. And you can find a link to that on the top of my Twitter. So, just search for Trevor Klee on Twitter, and I've got the post pinned. Or if you're an accredited investor and you want to invest $25,000 or more, You can also reach out to me directly through my website, trevorklee.com. I'm very easy to find online. I'm super Googleable. So, feel free to reach out to me, Twitter, trevorklee.com, whatever. Yeah. And of course, if anyone has any questions, clarifications, that sort of thing before wanting to invest money, more than happy to talk.
That's great. That's great. Well, Trevor, thanks so much for coming on the show. I'll put some links down there in the show notes so people know where to find you.
All right. Thank you very much, Will. It was a pleasure talking to you again.
Absolutely.
Special thanks to our sponsor, Bismarck Analysis, for the support. Bismarck Analysis creates the Bismarck Brief, a newsletter about intelligence-grade analysis of key industries, organizations, and live players. You can subscribe to Bismarck Brief at brief.bismarckanalysis.com. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with a new episode of Narratives. Special thanks to Donovan Dorrance, our audio editor. You can check out Donovan's work and music at donovandorrance.com.